Welcome to week 1. In today's lesson, we will be talking about what sociology is, a nice, pretty overview of what this chapter is all about, and some of the science behind sociology. Rich relatives. If you tell me that you have relatives that live far away, especially in bigger cities, over, say, 3 or 4 hours from us, I will assume that they're rich. I think relatives that are far away are rich. Why do I believe this? Our brains associate our experiences with what is true in general. My relatives who lived in New York City and on the East Coast, they were rich compared to me. They still are rich compared to me. And so I assume that my experience is the same as your experience, is kind of true worldwide. And while logically I can assume that I am someone else's relative, including those people who live out on the East Coast, and I'm not rich, so my logic breaks down very, very quickly. But still, I kind of assume that it's true, and I have to kind of check myself with logic, right? Asians are good in math, right? Everybody knows that because they're just naturally smarter, right? The death penalty is scary, so therefore it reduces crime. Because if I feel like I might be killed by the state if I commit a heinous crime, then I'll be scared away from doing it, so everyone else must feel the same. When I was 2 years old, I had 2 mothers. They were never in the same room together, but they switched, like in the kitchen area is what I assume, right? And how did I know that I had 2 mothers, even though they both looked the same? Because one of them was nice and one of them was mean. And in my brain, they couldn't be the same person because they were very, very different to me. Sociology uses science to answer questions that we all have in our minds about people, okay? And so while my silly examples are things that I believed in the past, right? The truth is that we all believe things that are probably fictional as well. And without testing them to find out, are they actually true? We will probably hang on to inaccurate, bad ideas. And since our politicians and government leaders are human just like us, they also have beliefs and ideas that are inaccurate. So sociology tries to answer common human questions using science, right, as a tool. Right? Now, science, in essence, tries to answer questions and solve problems. That's what it does. And science, in my mind, is really more of a verb than it is a noun. It's a process for doing things. How do you know that something's true? You can use science to test it out and to try to find out if it's actually true. Right? It does a fairly good job, by the way. It doesn't always get it right, but we are here talking, or you're listening to me through technology, which is in large a result of technological success that uses as its foundation scientific understanding of the world through chemistry, biology, physics, electronics, and so on. Medicine. We have amazing medical tools today that are there as a result of science. Right? We are launching rocket ships to the moon. People are talking about going to Mars. We have come so far from where we were a few hundred years ago, and a lot of that success has been because of our scientific understandings of the world. Is science's power unlimited? No, it's limited. Science can only study things that can be measured, right? And whenever I think that question, well, what can't be measured, I always draw a blank. Like, what can't be measured? How many angels can fit on the head of a pin? This is not a scientific question, right? Doesn't make it bad. Are near-death experiences real? This is not a scientific question. It doesn't make it a bad question. It doesn't mean that it's inferior. What it means is science can't do that because it can't be measured, right? Just kind of like a hammer isn't good for painting a picture. It just can't do that. That's not what it's able to do, okay? And the reason I stress this point is that sometimes in our society, we feel like a science is overwhelming us, and we get insecure and we get afraid and we kind of become angry at scientists and intellectuals because we feel like they're so smart and they think they know everything, and kind of this, we get into our kind of defensive shell about it. Science. But science is like anything else. It has its good sides and it has its limitations. One of the things that is important about sociology is the concept of the sociological imagination. This is a fancy term that refers to the link between me and my society. How do I separate what is personal, meaning it's just about me, or at least mostly about me, and what is going on in my society? For instance, let's say it's Friday night and I'm feeling lonely. Is this a personal problem because I chose to sit in my house and sit in my little social bubble and not talk to anybody, so therefore when it comes to Friday night, I haven't taken the time to build the relationships with other people, so this is a personal issue and it's not really fair to me to put it on society? Right? Or is this a social issue that is larger than just me, and there are millions of people in a similar situation to me, and so you could say, well, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and so it's not personal. This is a societal thing. We are being told we need to remain away from other people. We're in a situation where society is structured to almost encourage people to be alone. You can go through the drive-thru so you don't have to make a meal with, say, your family. You can watch Netflix rather than going to the movie theater. We have automatic garage door openers so that we don't have to interact with our neighbors when we come home from the day. And so, in this sense, people being lonely is a societal problem, right? So that link between our personal lives, or what you might say, biography, mixed with societal problems, is this idea of the sociological imagination. Understanding how our personal problems are not just about us, but they are profoundly impacted by the society in which we live. They say if one person can't get a job, we oftentimes blame them. We tell them they're lazy and they need to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But if millions of people can't find a job, then we have an economic depression and we have a real social problem, not just an individual one. It is not easy to determine whether a problem is a personal problem or a social problem. Let me give you an example that is relevant to today's issues. Police violence toward a black man, right? You have people that will point to the individual black man, and say, what was he doing? Was he disrespectful? Was he carrying a weapon? Was he committing a crime? right? That's the personal, that's the biological, right? And then you can say, okay, well, maybe all of those things are true, right? From a society perspective, the number of black men who are the victims of police violence is significantly higher than other groups, specifically Asians and whites, right? And so while you can certainly make the argument that any one black individual that's the victim of police violence is at fault for their actions. Maybe they were threatening the police officer. Maybe they refused to comply. All these number of individual personal reasons why the police chose to use force against that person. But if you compare it to other racial groups, it's hard to make the argument and say, well, certainly, there are young, disrespectful white males and Asian males and Latino males and Native American males and black males. Why is it that so basically in some ways kind of they're all similar, right? Because you've got young black males who are disrespectful, you've got young white males that are disrespectful, Latino males, and so on. Why is it that the number of black men, the violence is so high? And so this is where many people draw the conclusion that it's not a personal issue, it's a societal issue. It's a social problem. This is using the sociological imagination. It is hard to do that on any one specific case. So this is why when the news talks about a new incident involving an African American who was killed by the police, you'll have lots of debate, and you'll have the conservative side saying one thing, you'll have the liberal side saying another, and it is difficult to understand on that one case. But if you kind of zoom out and look at hundreds or thousands of cases, then you can draw the pattern and say, okay, here we've got a social problem. That's using our sociological imagination. So what is a social problem? Ugly houses. I drive through neighborhoods and they're pink and red and they're like all the same except for their outward colors. Getting up in the middle of the night to have to go pee. That's so annoying. There are too many types of cereal in the grocery store. I go in there and I'm so overwhelmed reading ingredients lists, finding out how much sugar, how much fiber, too many choices for me. I'm overwhelmed. That's a real problem. So, what is an actual social problem? Well, first of all, you have to have some actual harm that's being done to people. People have to be suffering, or society has to be suffering, or at least the physical world that we live in has to be suffering. And it has to be measurable. In order for us to understand it as a scientifically, you have to be able to quantify that data.
There have been so many fires spreading through California the last few months, and some of the footage is insane. A lot of people confused.
So the recent California fires are very strange and suspect. In drone footage of the aftermath, we see houses completely obliterated and turned to ash while the surrounding landscapes and trees are totally fine.
A clip of a tree that a guy found that was burning from the inside out.
A haunting but mesmerizing scene from the wildfires in Sonoma County. A man came across this tree burning from the inside out.
Now that situation doesn't happen in a forest fire. The only time trees really burn like that is when they're struck by lightning. But this is what the trees look like right after that. Yeah, they look exactly like the tree that supposedly caught fire during one of the wildfires. So you're probably thinking, Shane, where is this going? One word: lasers.
Okay, that guy, while he's super compelling and has like 24 million hits on that video, it's not actually scientific because you can't measure laser beams hitting trees. Does that make it not true? It's not for me to say whether it's true or not. What I can say is it is not a scientific question that can be investigated. Until it is, it's not sociology. And so some of the things that we'll talk about here, you may be thinking, well, what about this issue? And it's a conspiracy theory, but I believe it's true, right? Okay, it's hard for me to weigh in on those because it's sort of outside of the realm of science. And so that doesn't make it necessarily false, but right now the science hasn't looked at that or been able to measure that, so it's hard for me. It's not something that I can say yes or no on because it's not science. But there is a sense of subjective reality, right? There have been things that have been going on for a long time and people have been suffering, and you could have easily measured that, but it was not considered a social problem until recently. For instance, for thousands of years, people have been using drugs and suffering the consequences of addiction and brokenness, and yet only recently have we considered drug use to be a social problem. Another example would be the harming of children. Child abuse and neglect has become a very recent social problem, meaning it's 50 or 60 years old. It was back in the 50s when psychiatrists began advocating that there should be laws and movements to prevent parents from hurting their children. This concept of taking something that is familiar or has kind of always been there, but we've never seen it as a problem, is the concept of social constructionism. In this sense, society creates the meaning that a parent hitting their child, say, in the face, is now a problem that is not just a personal issue within the family, but something that we are all responsible for to protect that child, and that we should create laws and policies to protect that child even from their parents. That was not something that was believed previous to the 1960s, at least not in large numbers. We're taking something that has always been considered a personal problem, and now we're blowing it up and saying it is a social problem. It's a societal problem, not just a personal problem. You can think of a lot of personal problems, but if enough people have a personal problem, then you could say, wait a minute, maybe this is not just personal, maybe this is a social problem. The easiest thing that I can think of that pops into my head is obesity. Obesity, we typically think about as a personal problem. This person is doing that. This person's doing this. They're not getting enough sleep. They're not getting enough exercise. They're not eating their vegetables. They're whatever. And yet, if you look at our society at large, no pun there intended, what you can see is a dramatic increase in obesity rates, specifically in the last 30 years. And you ask yourself, wait a minute, what's going on in the last 30 years that's caused so many more people to be obese than they were, say, back in the 1980s, right? Well, I don't know, but here's some thoughts. The amount of soda that has been available has also increased dramatically. In fact, the amount of sugar that's in our diet specifically has gone up dramatically. We are eating a lot more processed foods than we were. We're commuting more. We'll end there. Okay, so how did problems go from being personal to being social? Well, typically they start on the personal level where people begin to say, wait a minute, maybe this is bigger than just an individual problem. Oftentimes you have somebody famous like Bono from U2 who's advocating, who has a loud voice, meaning that he's got an audience to talk to. And so he is telling politicians, he's telling his fans, hey, this is an issue that's going on. It's not just personal. You should make it your problem. We need to do something. Or somebody in authority, a president, a psychiatrist, is saying, this is a real problem. We sort of look up to those people, trust their authority, and the society begins to say, you know what, we as a group need to be doing something to help the individuals. And then generally there's a push for legal or policy change. That's the process of something becoming a social problem. So, how does sociology explain how the world turns? In truth, sociology doesn't even agree with itself. There are lots of different theories as to why things happen the way they do. Our book talks about 4 specific theories, but trust me, there are many additional ones. Let's take the example of smartphones and see if we can't look at this issue of smartphones through the perspective of all 4 of the perspectives that our book mentions. Okay, so smartphones are amazing tools. It's like a Swiss Army knife of functions. I can talk to my friends. I can find directions to the grocery store. I can tell the smartphone that I want to lose 20 pounds in the next 6 months, and it will help me do that. I can communicate with my workplace when I'm not at work, when I'm actually at the pool with my child. Like, I can do work from there. It's an amazingly powerful tool that I get for $50 and a $25 or $50 monthly charge. On the other hand, the phone also has some downsides. I find it hard to put down the phone. It has addictive nature to it. People drive while they use their smartphone. This is fatal. We have people who are not only killing themselves, but also other people because they are distracted away from driving. It makes us emotionally weak, especially if I turn to the smartphone when I'm having a hard time. Hey, why is that bad? This is bad because I am using the smartphone to cover over the feelings that bubble up. And so rather than working through them and solving the actual issue or strengthening my inner core, heart, spirit, something like that, I am just ignoring it through my smartphone because it's always there and it's always good for a few mental squirts of adrenaline. This theory is known as functionalism. It's this idea that society is a whole working together, and so smartphones are both good, they're functional, and they're dysfunctional, right? And so to the degree that they help strengthen society, it is functional, and to the degree that it separates parts of society and causes the main purposes of society to suffer, it's dysfunctional. Let's move on to another theory. Let's talk about rich people and their conflict with the rest of us. So, let's talk about smartphones from that perspective. So many people in America work for rich corporations, and the cell phone is a way of them working when they're not at work, per se. They're at the pool with their child, and they're checking their emails from their bosses. They're doing projects for clients, right? Well, that is a situation where the worker is adding value, creating dollars for the rich owner of the organization and taking that time away from their family. Amazon, Facebook, Google, these are gigantic corporations that are actually have larger economies than many countries in the world, right? And they're the ones either directly selling us the phones or getting us to give them money via the phone, like Amazon. We can shop for products while we're at the pool, around the dinner table, whatnot. They can sell us them while we're in the loo. Hey, what's the loo? The loo is an old-fashioned term for toilet. While we're at the drive-thru, while we're jogging. I don't buy products from Amazon while I'm on the toilet. So companies like Facebook and Google make money by getting our attention. Our time is what they sell. So for every minute that we spend on a social media platform or searching through a search engine, they get advertising dollars. And so you don't have to quote unquote buy anything. They're able to sell your attention. Right? Okay. So that is a way that smartphones benefit the rich. What about the rest of us? Isn't a smartphone a beneficial thing for all the rest of us? I mean, we all use it and seem to have a very hard time letting go of it, so clearly we like it, at least to some degree. Yes, there are positive sides to this, and it's actually a way of us getting one up on the rich. You see, traditionally, media and communications, at least my ability to spread a message to, say, 1 million people was very reduced. It was very hard for me to reach thousands and forget millions of people unless I got in the newspaper or was on a television station, magazine. But today, with new media, with smartphones everywhere, I can jump on YouTube, create a cool video, and be seen by millions, potentially even billions of people. And so I don't have to worry about traditional rich people-owned media companies. I can do my own thing with the help of smartphones. This theory, of course, that I just described is conflict theory. This clash between the rich who own and control the media, the land, the banks, they influence the government very heavily, and then the rest of us who work for the rich. All right, well, how about feminist theory? How do they think about and look at smartphones? So media has traditionally promoted traditional gender roles. Women's role was to support men, to care for children and the home, to over-feminize women. Over-feminize women? Is that really a word? Perhaps over-feminize is not a word, but what I mean is that it reduces women to their female parts. And so it encourages society to see women as being very different from men. And if you compare human males and human females with, say, I don't know, male walruses with female walruses, you see a much larger difference between those two. What over-feminizing women does is that it sort of mentally traps women into the traditional gender roles of being a wife and mother as their primary role, even if they're also working in addition to those things. It also traps men into the provider, strongman role where maybe otherwise they would be more in tune with their emotions and more willing to equally share in the responsibilities of home and childcare. On the other hand, mobile technology has opened up new opportunities for both men and women. And so, whereas traditionally women wouldn't be in their own media productions or have entrepreneurial opportunities, mobile technology has opened things up for them as well. And we haven't had time to establish gender role expectations for these new media roles, and so women are able to do things in new media that maybe they couldn't do in old media. Finally, symbolic interactionism focuses on the fact that smartphones decide what I even consider. There are about 1 million things that happened in the United States today that are significant. But the media, which will come to us via smartphone, will only capture about less than 0.1% of those things. The rest of them are just chucked out because they can't talk about everything, and so I won't consider those other events unless I hear about them from a friend or I experience them personally. And so in this way, mobile technology and media in general tells me what is significant. Now, I may buy into that more or less, but still, for the most part, most people will consider what the media is telling them, and they will focus on that, even if they are focused on how wrong the media is. Picture the guy screaming at his television at how stupid the news anchors are. Well, he may disagree with the news anchors, but his mind is still on the things that the news anchors are telling them. So that gives them an incredible amount of control. And then, if you think back to conflict theory, who controls the media? The rich. So the rich are really giving us our options. They're giving us our framework to how to think about the world. Let's talk about the science of sociology, which is the how things are done. It's the verb. I want you to imagine that you wanted to test whether having friends makes you happy. Hey, you just said makes. You can't do that. That's true. Science rarely says that one thing causes another. It's much safer to say that two things are related or that they are correlated with. Right? It is very difficult to say that say having friends makes you happier, because maybe happy people are easy to be friends with. And so they would have been happy whether they had friends or not, and unhappy people don't make good friends, so they don't have very many of them. So it's very difficult to say that having lots of friends makes you happy, because maybe it's the opposite. Maybe being happy makes you have lots of friends, right? So kind of all of that kind of just means that it's just safer to say that does one thing correlate with another? So here would be a better way of saying this. Let's see if having lots of friends is associated with being happy. That's safe. We don't know. We're not saying it causes it. We just want to know if those two things are related or associated in some way. So the first thing we have to do is we have to define, what are we talking about when we say friends? Does that mean friends on social media? Probably not. We would probably say, no, actually the research says that the more time you spend on social media, the more depressed and anxious you are. So we need to say, okay, what do we mean by friendship? And so we could have a definition. When we mean friendship, we mean spending an hour interacting with that person either face-to-face or via phone or video chat, 1 hour once a month. And if you have that with a person, then that is a friendship. That's how we're defining that. Okay? So far, so good. What do we mean by happiness? And while we probably all know, well, I know what happiness looks like, But how do you define it? How do you measure it? And that's much harder than just kind of this gut level of, I know what I mean by happiness. We'll just create a definition for happiness, and we could say that happiness is defined by waking up in the morning and feeling like today's going to be a good day. That's a definition, and then we could study that, and we could say that that should happen the majority of time. So if the majority of the time you wake up and feel like today's going to be a good day, then we're going to define you as happy. Important part, we've defined our variables. Then we need to decide how to collect our information, not just asking our friends. Asking our friends is biased, very biased, because maybe they're going to think that if they answer the question wrong, they're going to upset us, but maybe my friends are different from the general population that I want to study. Plus, my friends are not random, they have been selected over years. If I want my information to be about a certain group, let's say what I really care about is understanding whether there's an association between having lots of friends and being happy for people in Southern Illinois. Well, then Southern Illinois is my population that I care about, and I'm going to have to get a group, a sample, because there are tens of thousands of people in Southern Illinois. I can't ask all of them, but what I'm going to have to do is find a group of people and assume that they represent the larger group. They're a sample. And so the best way to get a good sample is to have an equal opportunity for everybody in Southern Illinois to be in the sample. So you could take everybody's name in Southern Illinois, put them into, write them down on a piece of paper, cut up the piece of paper so that there's one name on each piece of paper, throw it into a gigantic hat and pull out 150 pieces of paper, and that's your sample. So we've talked about what sociology is, what defines social problems, and the science of sociology. What do you do to help reduce the social problems that exist? Individual action is not sufficient. I can do my best to recycle and be nice to people, give to charity, things of that nature, but it's just not going to be enough to make a significant difference in a social problem. Well, hey, are you saying we shouldn't do those things? Definitely not saying that you shouldn't do those things. Those things are great, but they're only impacting things on an individual level. And remember, social problems are on a societal level, and it is very difficult and slow to have individual actions, especially if you're not famous or powerful, to have those impact the larger society. Now, it's happened throughout history, and that's amazing, but what happened generally in these small groups is that they began to change social policy through their influence. So what actually has to happen? Social policy, influence. Okay, policy has to change. And what policy is the things, it's the culture, it's the rules. Every organization has a policy, every government has a policy. And so those rules, and you could say the culture, the norms have to change. You got to have a new normal. Let's talk about recycling. It's a fairly good example on this. On an individual level, you should recycle. But your recycling is not going to make a significant difference on a social problem. The social policies around recycling must change in order to change the social problem. What are some examples of that? If the city changes its policies so that every Friday the recycling truck comes by 3/4 of the houses in your city and picks up recycling, That is a social policy change, assuming that it wasn't happening before, of course. But what that does is it creates a new normal. Because now, for the average person, not just the hippies who were maybe recycling by taking their recycling to, a town 30 miles away, but in the kind of the everyday person who maybe isn't super engaged in this cause, the policy change makes it easy for people who are not passionately interested in this cause enough to go way out of their way to promote it. Policy makes it easy to do these things, right? Policy changes what is normal in the minds of society. When the policies change, people begin seeing the issue differently because now they begin seeing it as something that has the approval of the government and those in power. Again, individual action to solve social problems is good, but in order to create lasting change on a society level, you have to have policy change. Now, much of the time, it starts out as individual action, but people begin to realize that their individual actions are not sufficient. And so policy oftentimes eliminates barriers that would otherwise be there. It makes things easier, it makes things cheaper, it moves resources around, it increases awareness so that the movement grows from just being from a few very passionate people to now it is a normal for people in society. And that is my lecture over chapter 1.